The moment that changed everything came without warning. What appeared to be an administrative routine from the outside turned out to be the spark that ignited one of the most intense crises within the modern royal family. A decision, quietly made and initially barely noticed, unleashed a chain of events within a few hours that extended far beyond familial tensions. At its heart were two children, a signed contract, and the question of how much control an individual truly retains when institutions begin to tighten their protective mechanisms. It began with a legal step, officially presented as a pragmatic solution. A document soberly worded, without pathos, without any public fanfare. But it was precisely this silence that set off alarm bells. For those who act quietly in royal circles usually do so for good reason. Observers quickly realized that this step was not an isolated event, but rather the visible part of a long-prepared strategy. Attention immediately turned to the children, whose daily lives were suddenly transformed without explanation. Within a few days, evidence mounted that this was no ordinary custody battle. Administrative decisions that normally take months were expedited. Responsibilities shifted, communication channels were blocked, and appointments were cancelled. All of this occurred without public explanation, further increasing external pressure. In London, people spoke of a situation that would be uncontrollable if it became public. This very fact made it all the more explosive. The focus increasingly shifted to the man who had signed the crucial document. His role was reassessed, and his previous public statements were interpreted differently in retrospect. Critics saw it as an act of capitulation. Supporters saw it as an attempt to limit the damage. One thing was certain. With this signature, a point had been crossed where private conflicts became institutional matters. The move was seen as an admission that the situation had spiraled out of control. Simultaneously, reports of unrest within the children's immediate environment grew. Changes in the school setting, abrupt disruptions to established routines, and conspicuous communication gaps caused concern internally. In royal circles, this was not interpreted as a coincidence, but as a possible warning sign. The protection of minors is considered a red line there, the crossing of which has immediate consequences. This very logic now kicked in. While the public was still puzzling over the situation, prearranged procedures were already underway behind closed doors. Legal reviews, psychological assessments, and security evaluations were all intertwined. The picture that emerged was of an apparatus that didn't improvise, but relied on tried and tested emergency plans. The real shock lay less in the severity of the measures than in their precision. Nothing seemed spontaneous. Everything followed a clear plan. At the same time, the narrative shifted. What had previously been perceived as a personal conflict took on a new dimension. Questions of responsibility, influence, and possible motives moved to the forefront. Why now? Why with such decisiveness? And why did it seem as if several agencies had been waiting for this moment for a long time? These questions fueled speculation and created a climate in which every detail was reinterpreted. At the end of this first chapter, there was no resolution, but a certainty. The crisis had only just begun. The signed contract was not an endpoint, but a starting signal. It made clear that decisions about the children's future were no longer negotiated privately. This opened up a space for questions of power, old protocols, and an institutional logic that leaves little room for emotion. Which forces would ultimately take the reins and how far they were prepared to go remained to be seen. With the opening of that internal dossier, later known only as the Red Folder, the tone in the center of power changed abruptly. What had previously been treated as a private problem was now classified as a structural risk. The contents of this folder not only compiled individual incidents but also revealed a pattern that, from the perspective of those in charge, could no longer be ignored. Decisions that had previously remained discreetly in the background suddenly moved into the focus of a coordinated crisis management effort. The speed with which processes were reorganized was striking. Deadlines were moved forward, responsibilities redistributed, and reports consolidated. Within a few hours, a situation report emerged, driven less by emotion than by sober assessment. At its core was the concern that stability had been lost, not as a headline, but as a risk analysis. This very shift in perspective made the situation so extraordinary. The red folder contained evidence of abrupt disruptions in the children's daily routines. Documented changes, a lack of transitions, unexplained decisions. For outsiders, these points only coalesced into a coherent narrative later. Internally, however, they were considered warning signs. In a system that relies on continuity and predictability, such disruptions are considered an alarm signal. They don't necessarily point to guilt, but rather to a loss of control. Simultaneously, the focus intensified on legal and financial structures. Contracts previously considered secure were re-examined. Promises that once seemed self-evident lost their validity. This reassessment wasn't an attack, but a safeguard. The red folder made it clear that they no longer wanted to rely on verbal agreements or informal arrangements. Everything had to be verifiable, reliable, and, if necessary, enforceable. The deeper the investigation went, the more apparent another aspect became: the question of intentions. Not in the sense of making assumptions, but as an analysis of possible developments. What happens when decisions are no longer made jointly? What are the consequences when children become part of a larger narrative that extends beyond their immediate needs? These questions increasingly dominated internal discourse. The pressure also grew because external signals were no longer clear. Communication channels broke down. Feedback failed to materialize or arrived late. In an environment based on clear processes, this is considered a disruptive factor. The red folder thus became a symbol of growing uncertainty that could not be dispelled with public statements. Instead, mechanisms that had not been activated for a long time were resorted to. These mechanisms were designed to concentrate responsibility and shorten decision-making processes. They presupposed that trust had already been shaken. This was precisely the turning point. Not a single incident, but the sum of gaps, ruptures, and unanswered questions led to a redefinition of the situation. What began as a private matter became a case demanding institutional responses. Initially, little of this leaked out. The silence seemed almost provocative, yet it was part of the strategy. The aim was to avoid escalating the situation while internal clarity was established. Nevertheless, enough initial clues seeped through to fuel speculation. Observers spoke of a power shift, a moment when the reins of power were reassigned. At the end of this phase came the realization that the red folder was more than just a collection of papers. It marked the transition from reaction to prevention. Those in charge had decided to no longer wait. This paved the way for decisions that would have profound consequences. The role played by the man who had previously signed the agreement now inevitably moved into the spotlight of the next phase. With the signing of the agreement, a figure previously perceived as more reactive was thrust into the center. Suddenly, his name was on a document that carried not only legal but also symbolic weight. Observers interpreted this step as a watershed moment. He separated the past from the present and made it clear that the situation could no longer be controlled by waiting or tactical silence. The signature became a signal to all involved that a new framework was in place. Within a few hours, a reassessment began. Previous statements, interviews, and public appearances were reread in retrospect. What had once been interpreted as loyalty now appeared as inner conflict. Critics spoke of pressure that could no longer be avoided. Others saw it as an attempt to assume responsibility before external forces did so completely. Regardless of the interpretation, it was clear that this decision had not been made in a vacuum. Internally, the agreement was considered a necessary step to secure room for maneuver. The legal structure aimed to prevent escalation while simultaneously regaining control. But therein lay the irony. By creating formal clarity, the step simultaneously revealed how little informal understanding was still possible. The signature seemed like an admission that trust had already been lost. At the same time, public pressure mounted. Media reports were overwhelming, and experts analyzed every detail. The question was no longer whether a rift had occurred, but how deep it ran. The close proximity in time between the signing and the emergence of new allegations was particularly explosive. This coincidence fueled speculation about motives and collusion. Was the move defensive or strategic? Was the aim to limit the damage or to draw a line under the matter and move on from Sadar? Within the inner circle, the decision was portrayed as having no alternative. It was argued that external developments had closed the window of opportunity. Delay would have increased, not reduced, the risks. From this perspective, the agreement was less an expression of strength than of necessity. This very perspective made it difficult for many to clearly categorize the decision. It seemed both resolute and forced. Added to this was the personal dimension. The signatory was visibly undergoing a period of reorientation. Public appearances were less frequently postponed or cancelled. This reticence was interpreted by some as a sign of an inner crisis, by others as a deliberate strategy. One thing was certain: the move left its mark, changed not only legal circumstances but also perceptions. The dynamic intensified further as evidence of additional revelations emerged. These hints suggested that the signing was not the end, but rather the beginning of a disclosure. The term turning point was now used more frequently. Observers saw it as the moment when the focus shifted from internal disputes to public narratives. The decision seemed to pave the way for statements that had previously been withheld. At the same time, it became clear that this step set other actors in motion. Institutions that had previously remained hesitant began to clarify their positions. Responsibilities were defined, and approval processes were accelerated. The signature had triggered a chain reaction that could no longer be stopped. They were forced to take a stand. At the end of this phase, an ambivalent picture remained. The decision was clear, but its consequences were not yet foreseeable. It created order and simultaneously intensified the conflict. The question of whether it would go down in history as an act of self-determination or as the result of massive pressure remained open. Only one thing was certain: after this step, a return to the status quo was impossible. The next phase would reveal what revelations would follow and which lines would be definitively crossed. With each new development, another figure came more prominently into focus, and the picture began to shift. What had long appeared to be a united front suddenly showed cracks. Observers spoke of a change in strategy, one that was less openly communicated than indirectly revealed. Decisions that had previously been made jointly now seemed unilateral. Appointments, collaborations, and public appearances followed a new pattern that raised questions about control and direction. The timing was particularly striking. While internal crisis mechanisms were already in place, external indications of new alliances and projects were mounting. This parallel development fueled doubts as to whether these were coincidences or deliberate signals. Rumors circulated in media circles about a clear break with previous ties, accompanied by an attempt to establish an independent narrative. The focus increasingly shifted away from familial connections and toward individual positioning. This is precisely where the most incisive analyses began. Critics saw signs that responsibility was being redistributed, not out of concern, but out of calculation. In this context, the children appeared less as subjects and more as part of a larger picture. This impression was particularly alarming within institutional circles. As soon as minors appear to be involved in strategic considerations, different standards apply. At the same time, evidence of new networks emerged. Contacts that had previously played no role suddenly became relevant. Cooperations outside traditional structures moved to the forefront. For observers, this was a clear indication of a deliberate change of course. The break was not loud but consistent. Old certainties were abandoned, new options tested. This very dynamic reinforced the impression that it was no longer about short-term solutions, but about a long-term realignment. In this environment, the question of loyalty also gained importance. Who was still on which side? Who had influence and who was losing it? The answers to these questions increasingly differed, depending on the perspective from which one looked. While some commentators spoke of self-determination, Others saw a creeping loss of control. The truth seemed to lie somewhere in between. Internally, this development was viewed with growing skepticism. Indications of potential monetization, new media narratives, and shifting priorities led to a reassessment of the situation. The focus was no longer solely on past decisions, but on the risks of future actions. This involved less moral judgment and more impact assessment. What dynamics emerge when personal strategies clash with institutional protective interests? Public perception further exacerbated the situation. Every new report, every rumor, every hint became part of a larger puzzle. The narrative oscillated between victim and perpetrator portrayals, without a clear consensus emerging. It was precisely this ambiguity that made the situation explosive. It allowed room for speculation and intensified the pressure on all involved. At the end of this section, a picture of fragmentation emerged. Where unity had previously been suggested, a complex web of interests, fears, and ambitions now emerged. The shift in strategy was palpable, but its consequences were not yet fully foreseeable. What was clear, however, was that this development was preparing the ground for the next stage of escalation, because the further apart positions diverged, the greater the need for clear boundaries became. The crucial question now hanging in the air was what role old protocols and new instruments of power would play. As the crisis intensified, mechanisms long considered relics of the past came into play. Suddenly, terms that usually only appear in historical retrospectives were circulating. Old protocols were dusted off, reinterpreted, and adapted to the present. To outsiders, this step appeared drastic internally, but it was considered a logical consequence. When modern means are no longer sufficient, an institution resorts to tried and tested structures. These protocols are not emotional but functional. They are based on the assumption that stability is more important than short-term approval. This very logic now determined the actions taken. Decisions were no longer made in the context of public perception, but rather along clearly defined lines of responsibility. The focus shifted to prevention, not reaction. This also changed the tone. What had previously seemed like a dispute now took the form of a regulated process. The central question was who would bear responsibility in the future, not symbolically but practically. Who would decide on routines, protective measures, and long-term planning? These questions were not discussed publicly, but resolved in closed sessions. This revealed how closely historical experiences are intertwined with current assessments. Past crises served as reference points for classifying today's risks. It was striking how quickly these structures could be activated. This suggested that they had never truly disappeared. They were merely waiting for the moment when they would be needed again. In this phase, the balance of power shifted definitively. Individual actors lost room for maneuver, while institutional powers gained influence. This development was subtle but consistent. At the same time, it became clear that modern challenges demand new answers. Old protocols alone were no longer sufficient. They were supplemented by modern safeguards, legal adjustments, and media shielding. The goal was clear: to regain control over narratives before they spiraled out of control. This approach demonstrated how flexible even long-established structures can be when under pressure. The return of these mechanisms also had a psychological effect. It signaled decisiveness and set clear boundaries. For supporters, this was reassuring. For critics, it seemed authoritarian. But this very ambivalence was part of the strategy. It left no room for ambiguity. Those who had previously relied on gray areas now found themselves confronted with firm rules. At the same time, public communication was further reduced. No lengthy explanations, no justifications. Instead, short, precise signals. This reticence reinforced the impression that decisions had already been made. Observers spoke of a phase of consolidation, in which the focus shifted from debate to implementation. This phase also revealed how differently time is perceived. While the public waited for quick answers, those in charge worked in longer cycles. Their perspective extended over weeks and months. The question was not how to survive the next headline, but how to prevent long-term damage. This perspective explained why the measures seemed so decisive. At the end of this phase came the realization that the crisis had reached a new level. Old protocols had returned not out of nostalgia, but out of necessity. They marked the transition from conflict to order, but every order has its price. What long-term effects this return of historical mechanisms would have remained an open question. Would it ensure stability or create new conflicts? And how would those react whose room for maneuver was now clearly limited? With the implementation of the final measures, it was clear that this crisis would not end with a single decision. It had long since developed a momentum of its own that extended far beyond the initial trigger. What had begun as a family conflict had become a fundamental struggle over power, responsibility, and control. The battle lines were no longer drawn merely emotionally, but structurally. The immediate consequences quickly became apparent. Public appearances were reassessed, projects halted or quietly shelved. Institutional actors assumed the power to interpret events, while individual scope for action continued to shrink. This shift appeared cold and technocratic to outsiders, but therein lay its strength. It deprived escalation of its emotional fuel and replaced it with procedures, rules, and responsibilities. At the same time, the public narrative changed. Media outlets, previously focused on personal dramas, began to recognize the structural dimension. It was no longer about sympathies but about precedents. What boundaries apply when private decisions have public consequences? And how far can an institution go to enforce its protective rights? These questions increasingly moved to the forefront of reporting. In the long term, a scenario emerged in which relationships would have to be redefined. Trust, once shattered, could not simply be restored. Instead, formal arrangements took its place. These offered security but little room for intimacy. Observers saw this as the price of stability. Others warned that this very coldness could generate new tensions. For children, too, this development represented a cessation. Their daily lives were restructured, their environment more closely monitored, their public profile reduced. From the perspective of those in charge, this was a necessary form of protection. However, critical voices questioned the potential long-term consequences of such isolation. The balance between protection and freedom remained a sensitive issue that was not definitively resolved. New strategies were already taking shape behind the scenes. Legal clarifications, institutional reforms, and internal evaluations indicated a desire to learn from the crisis. The goal was to identify and prevent similar escalations earlier in the future. This preventative approach demonstrated that the events were understood as a warning signal, not an exception. Ultimately, the situation remained ambiguous, leaving no clear-cut winner or loser. The institution had proven its capacity to act. Individuals had lost influence, but the price was high. Relationships were damaged, narratives hardened, and room for maneuver narrowed. The crisis had brought clarity but also raised new questions. The outlook, therefore, remained ambivalent. On the one hand, there was order. On the other, uncertainty about the long-term consequences. Would this period of control lead to lasting stability or merely be a calm before the next storm? And how would the public react when quiet decisions had tangible consequences? These open questions mark the point at which the story, while reaching a provisional conclusion, is likely to resonate for a long time to come. The events that unfolded in rapid succession mark one of the most sensitive moments in modern royal history. What began as an internal decision developed into a structural crisis in which private conflicts and institutional protective interests became inextricably intertwined. The trigger was not a single scandal, but a series of subtle steps that, taken together, sent a clear signal. Trust was shattered, control was threatened, and action was unavoidable. At the center were two children whose daily lives and futures became the benchmark for all decisions. It was precisely this focus that shifted. Emotional narratives lost their significance, while procedures, protocols, and responsibilities took center stage. The signing of an agreement proved not to be a solution, but a turning point that triggered further processes. Old certainties crumbled, new power lines were drawn. The precision with which the institution reacted was striking. It did not act impulsively, but rather resorted to tried and tested, sometimes historical mechanisms, supplemented by modern safeguards. This combination made it clear that the goal was not short-term damage control, but long-term stabilization. At the same time, it revealed the price of this stability: reduced closeness, formalized relationships, and a tighter corset for individual decisions. Publicly, the image shifted from a personal drama to a debate about responsibility and limits. The question of how far protection should extend and where control begins remained open. It also remained unclear whether the measures taken would prevent future conflicts or merely postpone them. In the end, there is no final judgment, but rather a tense outlook. Order has been restored for the time being, but its sustainability remains to be seen. Will this phase be remembered as a necessary break or as the prelude to new confrontations? And how will the public react when the true consequences of quiet decisions become apparent?